thick with the smell of wet soil and rotting leaves. Sarah Gibson had been walking home from the edge of the fields. Her steps hurried when she heard them following. At first, she told herself it was nothing. Boys often laughed loudly, and she tried to ignore it. But then shadows moved behind her, quickening. She turned, and there they were. 5 men she knew by face, some even by name. They had drunk too much, their eyes glassy, their laughter sharp as knives. "Where are you going, Sarah?" One of them sneered, blocking her path. Another reached out and tugged at her sleeve. Panic flared in her chest. She tried to run, but the forest was dark and the ground uneven. Their hands caught her, rough and unrelenting, dragging her deeper between the trees. She screamed, her voice cracking, but the village houses were too far. Even if someone heard, no one came. They shoved her against a tree, the bark scraping her back through her thin dress. She begged them to stop, her tears already running, but their laughter only grew. Fingers clawed at her clothes, pulling and tearing, until fabric fell away piece by piece. She tried to cover herself, curling her arms across her chest, but they forced them aside. Her skin glistened with sweat and tears, the night air cold against her exposed flesh. The humiliation cut deeper than any knife. They jeered at her body, calling her names, treating her not as a person, but as an object. One slapped her face when she tried to turn away. Another yanked her hair so hard she thought her scalp would rip open. She screamed again, but the sound dissolved into the vast forest. Somewhere she thought she saw movement, a figure at the edge of the clearing. Emmanuel. For a brief moment, hope surged. He stood there, frozen, his face pale. He could have stepped forward, could have stopped it, but he did not. His eyes darted down, shame burning into his expression, and then he vanished into the trees. That betrayal hollowed her from the inside. The men pushed her to the ground, her knees cutting against stones. Their hands left bruises across her arms, her thighs. One by one, they forced her up against the tree again, stripping every last thread of dignity she had left. She was naked, trembling, her breath short, her voice a hoarse whisper begging them to let her go. They laughed louder. One spat at her chest, another pressed her face into the dirt. She felt her body bruised, torn, defiled, while her spirit broke apart. When they grew tired, they left her there. Not a woman anymore, but a carcass on the forest floor. Her skin was scratched, her body bleeding in several places. The night air cut into her rawness, and she lay still, her breath shallow, eyes staring at the canopy above. Stars blurred through tears. She thought of her mother, of her childhood laughter, of the life she might have had. None of it mattered now. The last sound she heard was their footsteps fading and their laughter echoing, cruel and endless. Her body gave up before dawn. Naked, cold, covered in mud and blood, she stopped breathing with her eyes still open. Insects soon gathered. The forest accepted her as its own, wrapping her in silence. But silence is never final. Something in the soil stirred as her blood seeped into the roots. Something ancient, something dark, awakened with her last humiliation. Sarah Gibson had died stripped of everything, but death would not be the end of her story. It took 3 days before anyone dared to enter the forest. A group of children had gone looking for firewood when one of them stumbled upon what they thought was a bundle of rags at the foot of a tree. The smell hit them first, sweet, sickening, the stench of rotting meat that clung to the back of the throat. When they looked closer, the rags were not fabric at all, but skin. Pale, split open in places, crawling with flies. The scream of the youngest boy brought half the village running. What they found was Sarah Gibson's body. Naked, splayed across the dirt as if discarded, her hair matted with blood, her thighs streaked with mud and dried fluid. Her skin had already begun to turn a gray-green color, peeling at the edges where insects had worked their way inside. Maggots writhed in the wounds across her arms and legs, burrowing deeper with every hour. Her eyes were still open, glazed and glassy, staring into the sky with a look that made grown men avert their gaze. It was the face of a girl who had seen too much before death finally claimed her. The villagers gathered, whispering in low voices. Some crossed themselves, others spat on the ground, muttering that she must have angered spirits to meet such an end. Not one of them spoke the truth aloud, that they all knew who had done this, that some of them had heard the screams and the laughter that night. Silence was easier than justice. Silence was safer. Emmanuel stood at the edge of the crowd, his hands trembling so badly he clenched them into fists to stop the shaking. His stomach churned at the sight of her, at the bruises blooming purple and black on her thighs, the scratch marks on her back, the rawness of her chest, where the bark of the tree had cut into her skin. Every detail screamed his failure. He had seen her that night, seen her pleading eyes, and had turned away. His mind told him he could not have fought them, that he would have been killed too. But his heart knew the truth. He had abandoned her. When the village elders ordered her burial, they rushed it. A cloth was thrown across her body, but it was too short, and her bruised legs remained visible as they carried her. Some women wept quietly, covering their mouths with their scarves. Others whispered cruel words, saying she must have invited this upon herself. The men who had been there that night stood among the mourners, faces expressionless, eyes never meeting Sarah's ruined form. They blended with the crowd, hiding behind the silence. The grave was shallow, dug in haste as if the earth itself resisted taking her in. Her body was lowered, still crawling with small white worms that squirmed in the folds of her skin. Emmanuel forced himself to stay until the last handful of dirt was thrown, but even then he could not move. His throat burned with words he could not say, apologies that would mean nothing to the girl beneath the soil. The shame pressed down on him heavier than the earth itself. That night, he lay awake in his small wooden house, staring at the ceiling while the sound of shovels and whispers replayed in his head. Every time he closed his eyes, he saw Sarah's face, mouth half open, eyes fixed on the sky, alive with terror even in death. He wanted to scream, to confess to someone, but the walls felt too close, the darkness too thick. He pressed his palms to his ears, trying to shut out the memory of her voice, but it was already inside him. In the forest, the fresh mound of dirt shifted slightly. A beetle crawled over it, disappearing into the cracks where blood had seeped into the soil. The trees stood silent, but the silence was heavy, watchful. The village slept, pretending not to know, while under the earth Sarah's body lay twisted and broken. And though her mouth could no longer scream, something deeper than flesh stirred restlessly in the dirt. The shame they buried with her was not hers, it was theirs. The forest at night was heavier than usual. Its silence stretched too far, as though the trees themselves were holding their breath. The shallow mound of earth that covered Sarah Gibson's body began to shift, a tremor so slight it could have been mistaken for the wind. But there was no wind. The air was still, damp with the smell of decay. The first movement came from her hand. Fingers curled, the nails cracked and thickened, soil pressing beneath them as they clawed upward through the dirt. Her skin was blackened, bloated with rot, but she moved with purpose, not the clumsy twitch of an animal. The earth cracked open slowly, spilling worms and loose stones as her corpse forced itself upward. Her face emerged next, strands of hair matted with mud hanging across her forehead. One eye sagged in its socket, clouded with the milky film of death. Her lips were split and torn, but as they opened, something like breath slipped through. It was not a gasp of air, but a hiss, deep and wet, carrying with it the sound of rage so thick it vibrated through the soil. She rose inch by inch, her chest jerking as though her ribs might break apart with each movement. Her body was stitched not by thread, but by death itself. The wounds that had once humiliated her now glowing faintly as if lit from within by embers. When she finally stood upright on the mound, naked and drenched in filth, she tilted her head back. A sound escaped her throat, half moan, half laughter, echoing between the trees like a song from something no longer human. The villagers in the nearest houses stirred in their sleep, muttering in fear without knowing why. Dogs began to bark, their cries sharp and panicked before they fell silent one by one, retreating into corners as if they knew the dead now walked. Sarah took her first step forward. Her foot sank into the mud, leaving behind a dark print that glistened with more than just water. It was blood seeping from her own body, still dripping even as she moved. Every joint cracked as she forced herself upright, each sound like bones splintering under weight. She reached for a tree to steady herself, her nails carving lines into the bark, leaving streaks of black and red. Her breathing grew louder, not the steady rhythm of the living, but a rasping wheeze, like knives dragging across metal. At the far edge of the village, a woman woke with a start. She swore she heard laughter, faint but close, like someone whispering into her ear. Another man, walking home late from the fields, felt the hairs rise on his arms when he passed the tree line. He could not see anything in the dark, but he heard it. Low moans, a wet sound mixed with something disturbingly close to pleasure, tangled with chuckles that had no warmth. He ran, not daring to look back. Sarah moved deeper into the forest, each step leaving a trail that pulsed faintly in the dark. Her mouth widened into a grin, though it split the skin across her cheeks. Her eyes glimmered with something new, not life, not death, but vengeance raw and untamed. The humiliation she had suffered, the laughter that had followed her into the grave, now fused into one sound that poured endlessly from her throat. It was laughter twisted into rage, a mockery thrown back at the world. By dawn, the mound of her grave was nothing but loose earth and an empty hollow. The villagers who came to the forest that morning found the ground disturbed, claw marks etched into the soil as though something had crawled out. They whispered in terror, some claiming animals had dug at the grave, others too afraid to speak what they truly feared. Emmanuel stood apart, staring at the churned earth, his lips dry, his eyes haunted. He could not stop hearing her voice in his head, the echo of her last scream, now mixing with the sound of laughter only he seemed to recognize. Sarah Gibson had awakened. She was no longer the girl stripped and broken. What returned from the dirt was something the forest itself had remade, and she would not rest until the laughter of her tormentors was silenced forever. The night was thick with silence when Sarah slipped into the village. She moved like shadow, her body dripping soil and blood, her hair hanging in clumps across her face. Her eyes burned with a cold brightness, locking onto the house of the first man. He had been the loudest that night, the one who had slapped her, the one who laughed as her body was torn apart. His name was whispered often in the village, but Sarah did not whisper. She remembered. She would never forget. Inside his hut, he slept heavily, drunk from rice wine. His chest rose and fell in careless rhythm, his mouth slack, unaware of the horror slipping closer. The window rattled softly, but he did not stir. Sarah's hand pressed against the wooden frame, her nails scraping a line deep into the wood before she slid inside. The air around her thickened, a chill that made the candles snuff out, though no wind passed through. She stood at the foot of his bed, her skin dripping onto the floor, her breath rasping like a saw against bone. When her hand clamped over his mouth, his eyes shot open. He tried to scream, but the sound died against her rotting palm. He struggled, but her strength was inhuman, dragging him up from the bed as though he weighed nothing. His feet kicked against the floor, knocking over a stool, but no one in the village came. Sarah pulled him out into the darkness, her grip like iron, her laughter low and broken. The forest welcomed them with silence. She dragged him to the tree where she had died, the bark still stained with the faint marks of her last moments. He recognized it instantly, his face draining of color as he realized where he was. She pushed him against the trunk, the same way he had once done to her, and with a cruel mockery of his own laughter, she began to strip him. His clothes tore easily beneath her sharp nails. He fought, begged, swore he would never touch her again, but she ignored him. Naked, trembling, he was no longer a man of power, but prey. She bound him with roots torn from the ground, wrapping them so tightly around his wrists and ankles that his skin bulged against them. He pulled and screamed, but the forest swallowed the sound, twisting it back into his own ears. Sarah tilted her head, watching him, her grin wide enough to split the skin of her cheeks again. She spoke no words, but her actions were clear. Tonight, he would feel what she had felt, only worse. She dragged her finger slowly across his chest, tracing the outline of his ribs. Then, with a sharp, deliberate cut of her nail, she broke the skin. Blood welled instantly, running down his side. He shrieked, thrashing, but Sarah pressed her hand against his shoulder with unnatural force, holding him still. She cut again, deeper this time, and then slid her fingers into the wound. The man's eyes bulged. His mouth stretched wide in a scream that seemed endless. Layer by layer, she worked, peeling his skin back as though she were opening a curtain. First the chest, where muscles twitched and pulsed beneath her hands. She studied them, as though memorizing every fiber, every vein. Then the arms, stripping flesh until bone gleamed wet beneath the moonlight. She moved slowly, methodically, her face hovering close as his skin tore away from him in strips. His screams became hoarse, breaking into sobs and gurgles, but she never stopped. By the time she reached his face, he was half gone, his voice little more than a rasp. She pressed her hand against his cheek tenderly, almost like a lover, before dragging her nail down, slicing the flesh away to reveal the white of bone beneath. He shook violently, eyes rolling back, but Sarah did not let him die quickly. Death was too kind. She wanted him to know every nerve, every shred of agony. Hours later, his body hung from the tree, skinless, glistening like butchered meat. His head lolled forward, mouth still open in a frozen scream. Blood pooled at the base of the trunk, soaking into the same soil that had once cradled Sarah's broken body. Birds did not sing there the next morning. Children who strayed too close saw it first and ran back screaming. The village gathered, horrified, some vomiting at the sight, others praying aloud. Whispers spread fast. Some said an animal had done it, though no beast stripped a man so clean. Others muttered Sarah's name, refusing to say it too loudly for fear she might hear. But the truth lived in every terrified glance, in every shiver when the wind passed through. They knew who had come back. Emmanuel stood at the back of the crowd, his face pale, his chest tight. He recognized the tree. He recognized the laughter he thought he'd heard the night before. His guilt deepened, a pit opening in his stomach. Sarah was back, and she had begun her revenge. The first blood had been spilled. It would not be the last. Do you want me to carry directly into Chapter 5, The Village in Fear, with the same detailed style, showing panic spreading and Sarah's haunting presence growing stronger? Here we go, continuing the story into Chapter 5, The Village in Fear, in one long narrative with clear, progressive flow and rich detail, no subchapters. Chapter 5, The Village in Fear. The morning after the first skinless corpse was found, the village lost its breath. People who once walked proudly down the dusty paths now moved in clusters, whispering, refusing to let their children wander too far. The market was quiet. The laughter of men who had once boasted loudly over their rice wine was gone, replaced by murmurs carried like sickness from house to house. Sarah's name passed through lips that barely opened, spoken as if she might step through the door at the sound of it. The elders tried to settle the fear by telling everyone it was an animal, some great beast from the forest. But no one believed it. Animals did not tie men to trees. Animals did not strip flesh clean. The truth lay heavy in the air, heavier than the smoke from morning fires. It was Sarah. Everyone knew it, and everyone had known the truth of what happened to her. Now the silence that had protected the guilty turned against them all. At night, the fear sharpened. Dogs howled at the forest but would not go near it. Their fur bristled, their tails tucked as they whined and clawed to be let inside. Children woke crying, claiming to hear footsteps outside their windows, slow and deliberate. Some said they heard breathing, wet and uneven, as though someone stood in the dark just beyond the thin walls. Mothers hushed them, but they trembled too, clutching their children until dawn. Emmanuel could not escape the weight pressing on his chest. Each night he lay awake, sweat soaking his sheets, even though the air was cool. He told himself she would not come for him, that he had not touched her, that he was not like the others. But his heart whispered otherwise. He had seen. He had done nothing. And that was enough. His dreams proved it. Each time he closed his eyes, Sarah appeared, naked, bruised, her skin torn where bark and hands had scraped it raw. She did not speak, but she looked at him with those wide, glassy eyes, her lips parted in silence. Sometimes she reached for him, and her touch burned like ice. Sometimes she laughed, the sound low and broken, making him wake with a cry caught in his throat. The men who had been part of her torment huddled together in corners of the tavern, their voices sharp with panic. One swore he saw her shadow move past his window, though no one else believed him. Another confessed he heard her laughter in his dreams, louder each night. They drank until their hands stopped shaking, but nothing drowned the terror. Each sunrise was only a pause before night came again, before the forest groaned with things that should not walk. The women, too, felt her presence. Washing clothes by the river, one said she saw a pale figure crouched on the opposite bank, hair hanging forward, water dripping from her body as though she had risen from the depths. When she blinked, it was gone. The other women rushed home, dropping baskets in the mud. No one returned to the river after dark. By the end of the week, the village was suffocating with fear. Doors were barred, lamps left burning through the night. Every creak of wood, every whisper of leaves made hearts race. And yet the forest remained patient, its silence stretching wider each night, waiting. Emmanuel tried to pray, tried to steady his hands as he worked, but nothing stilled the image of Sarah's grave, torn open by her own nails. He remembered her eyes that night, pleading for him, begging him to act, and he remembered how he turned away. That guilt followed him like a second shadow. Deep inside, he knew Sarah would not stop until every one of them felt what she had felt. And when she came for him, no prayer would keep her away. The village had once killed her with silence. Now her silence killed them in return. The second man had always been the one who bragged the loudest. He had been the first to touch Sarah when she screamed. The one who pinned her arms as the others stripped her bare. In the days since the first corpse was discovered, he drowned himself in liquor, yet no amount of burning liquid down his throat kept the nightmares away. Still, when night came, he could not resist sneaking out to the edge of the forest, convinced that hiding inside his house would only make him a cornered animal. He told himself he wanted air, that he needed to breathe. Deep down, he hoped the fear was only inside his head. But Sarah was waiting. She appeared to him not as the rotting corpse from Whispers, but as the girl he remembered, the one they had mocked, violated, broken. Her skin glowed pale in the moonlight, smooth and flawless. Her long hair spilled down her back, shimmering as if washed clean of mud and blood. She stood naked among the trees, her body whole, unmarked, her eyes wide but soft, as though she had forgiven. The man froze, his mouth falling open, breath catching in his throat. She raised a hand and beckoned him closer with a gentle curl of her fingers. Desire, crude and selfish, surged in him. Fear melted under it. He stepped toward her, trembling not with terror now, but with the hunger that had driven him the night they ruined her. She smiled faintly, tilting her head, her lips parting as though inviting him. He whispered her name, his voice hoarse, but she said nothing. She only reached out and touched his chest, her hand warm, her skin perfect. The man shuddered with something close to relief. Maybe the stories were wrong. Maybe Sarah was not a monster at all, but a spirit come to him, longing for him. She leaned in, her lips brushing his, soft and slow. He closed his eyes, surrendering to the fantasy, to the lie he wanted to believe. Her kiss deepened, her tongue pressing into his mouth, tasting of iron and smoke. His hands gripped her waist, pulling her closer, but his relief turned to horror in an instant. For when his palm slid across her back, her skin shifted beneath his fingers, slippery, wet, as though it were no longer attached. He pulled back, eyes wide, just as her flesh peeled away. Her beauty melted like wax under flame. Skin slid from her face in long strips, revealing the raw muscle beneath, wet and red, veins twitching like snakes. Her arms glistened with exposed sinew, her chest splitting to show the pulsing rhythm of a heart still beating in rage. Blood seeped from every seam, dripping onto his body, smearing his chest. Yet she did not let go. She pressed her mouth harder against his, forcing the kiss deeper. He screamed into her mouth, the sound muffled as she bit his lip, tearing it away in a spray of blood that mingled with her own. He thrashed, but her grip was merciless. With one hand, she cupped his cheek as though tender, while the nails of her other hand dragged slowly down his torso. Flesh split under her touch, opening him like cloth. He howled, his body arching as she carved him open, his blood running between them. Still she kissed him, her tongue sliding into his throat, choking him with the taste of rot. The more he struggled, the tighter she clung, until his knees buckled and he collapsed under her weight. She began to peel him as she had been peeled, but she did it with a lover's patience. She pulled the skin from his arms slowly, inch by inch, kissing him every time he tried to scream, swallowing the sound. His chest was laid bare, ribs gleaming, his muscles twitching against the cold night. His face contorted in agony, eyes flooding with tears, but she held his gaze with her own, eyes that glowed with fury and pleasure at once. When finally his body could take no more, she pressed her mouth to his one last time. Blood spilled from both their lips, mixing, dripping onto their bodies. He sagged against her, a skinless ruin, his heart slowing with each breath. She let him fall to the ground, but not before tearing the last strip of flesh from his face with her teeth. He lay motionless, a grotesque parody of intimacy, as though their embrace had consumed him entirely. By morning, his corpse hung twisted in the branches, skin draped like cloth over broken limbs. Villagers found him at sunrise, dangling above them like a butcher's trophy. His eyes were gone, his lips torn away, his body glistening in the dew. Women screamed, men vomited, children were dragged away before they could see too much. The whispers returned, louder now, spreading from door to door like fire. Some said Sarah's ghost was seductive, appearing beautiful before revealing her horror. Others claimed she would never stop until the last of them was gone. And in their houses, no one dared sleep deeply. For behind their eyelids, when dreams pulled them under, Sarah waited, sometimes flawless, sometimes flayed, but always hungry for more. The village no longer breathed in peace. Every corner smelled of fear. Mothers clutched their children closer, and men who once swaggered with loud voices now sat in silence, staring at the ground. But Sarah did not slow. The hunger of her vengeance grew sharper with each victim. Her rage was not satisfied with one or two deaths. It demanded more. The third man was found at dawn, crawling in the mud outside his house. He had managed to drag himself into the open, but his skin was gone. Every inch of his body was raw, red muscle glistening under the early light. His lips were gone, his eyes swollen with pain. He screamed hoarsely, every movement tearing the open tissue further, but he would not die quickly. Some villagers tried to help him, throwing cloths over his body, but the fabric stuck to his flesh, pulling it loose in chunks. He begged for death until his voice broke. Hours later, he finally stopped moving. His hand clawed into the earth as if still trying to escape. That same night, another was discovered nailed upright to a tree at the edge of the forest. His arms were stretched wide, pierced through with jagged branches. His chest had been cut open carefully, not like a wild beast tearing flesh, but like a surgeon with steady hands. His ribs were pried apart, his lungs exposed to the cool night air, still faintly rising and falling when he was first found. His eyes rolled in terror, his mouth gagged with his own torn shirt. He remained alive long enough to look directly at the villagers who stumbled across him, his face pleading for release, before his head dropped forward and he went still. The third was worse. His body was never found whole. Pieces of him appeared in different places, an arm hanging from a roof beam, his face nailed flat against a barn door, his skin stretched across the fence like parchment. The village was drenched in his remains, each discovery pushing the people deeper into horror. By now, doors were locked at sundown, bolts hammered into place, lamps left burning all night. Families huddled together, whispering prayers, but none dared speak Sarah's name out loud. They called her only the girl, or the shadow. Still, she came. No door was thick enough, no lock strong enough. She slipped through cracks, seeped through the dark, and always found her prey. The forest seemed to bend with her will, guiding her to the guilty, no matter how far they tried to hide. The air itself changed. Dogs no longer barked, they whimpered, tails tucked, refusing to step outside. The trees creaked at odd hours, though the wind was still. Some villagers swore they heard laughter weaving through the silence, low and wet, followed by moans that sounded half like crying, half like pleasure. And always, in the middle of this growing storm of fear, was Emmanuel. He felt her eyes on him even in daylight, a weight pressing against his chest whenever he stepped outside. His dreams were constant now. Sarah naked, her body torn, her flesh peeling while she reached for him with trembling arms. Sometimes she whispered his name, sometimes she laughed, but always she came closer. He woke gasping, drenched in sweat, his heart racing so hard he thought it might split. He tried to tell himself he was different, that he had not laid a hand on her. But guilt throbbed like a wound that refused to close. He had seen. He had chosen silence. That was enough. And he knew. Sarah knew it too. Her revenge was tightening its circle, cutting down the guilty one by one, until only those who had watched and done nothing remained. Every night, Emmanuel lit candles in every corner of his house. He whispered prayers into the smoke, his voice shaking. But behind the flickering flames, he thought he saw her shadow move. He thought he heard her footsteps outside his door. He thought he smelled the damp rot of her grave rising from the floorboards. The hunt was no longer about vengeance alone. It was about inevitability. Sarah was coming closer, and Emmanuel's guilt was the light that guided her. Emmanuel could no longer hide from himself. Nights without sleep had stripped him hollow, his face pale, his eyes sunken as though the guilt was eating him alive from within. He had tried to believe that Sarah's vengeance would pass him by, that her fury belonged only to the hands that touched her. But every time he closed his eyes, he saw her standing in the forest, naked and trembling, her wide eyes locked on his, silently begging him to step forward. And every time, he remembered how he turned away. One evening, when the whispers in his head grew unbearable, he walked to her grave. The forest was still, the air damp with the smell of moss and earth. The mound of soil where she had been buried was no longer neat. It sagged, cracked, claw marks cutting deep into its sides. Emmanuel knelt down, his hands trembling as he pressed them into the dirt. Tears spilled onto the soil, darkening it. "I should have saved you," he whispered, his voice shaking. "I should have fought for you. I should have died with you if that was what it took." He bent forward, pressing his forehead into the ground. "I loved you, Sarah. I always did, but I was a coward." The earth seemed to shiver beneath him, and when he pulled his head back, he gasped. The soil was wet, not with rain, but with something darker. Blood seeped from the cracks, slow at first, then steady, curling between his fingers as though the grave itself was weeping. Emmanuel fell back, his heart pounding, his breath ragged. He knew then that Sarah had heard him. That night, as he lay in bed, he felt her. At first, it was only the weight on the mattress, a subtle dip as though someone had sat beside him. He dared not move, dared not open his eyes. Then a cold hand touched his cheek. His skin burned under the icy pressure. Her voice followed, a whisper pressed directly against his ear. "You watched?" He gasped, his eyes snapping open to find only the dark ceiling above him. His body shook, but the hand remained, sliding from his face to his chest, pressing against his pounding heart. He wanted to run, to scream, but at the same time he wanted her to stay. His guilt and his desire twisted into one unbearable knot. Her presence grew stronger each night. Sometimes he woke to find her lying beside him, her form hidden in shadow, her hair brushing against his neck. Sometimes he smelled the rot of her grave mixed with something sweet, almost intoxicating. His body betrayed him, longing for her even as terror froze his veins. He whispered her name into the night, begging forgiveness, but the only answer was her laughter. Soft and broken, echoing from nowhere and everywhere at once. He began to lose his grip on the around him. Villagers spoke to him, but he heard only her voice. He stumbled through the streets with shaking hands, convinced she followed just behind him, unseen but near enough that her breath brushed his skin. In the forest, he thought he saw her standing between the trees, sometimes whole, sometimes stripped, sometimes nothing but muscle and veins shining wet under the moon. Each time he reached out, she vanished, leaving only silence. Emmanuel confessed again and again at her grave, falling to his knees until they bled, clawing at the soil until his fingers split. But forgiveness never came, only the steady bleeding of the ground, only the cold touch in the night. His words meant nothing to her. His cowardice was carved too deep. And yet, as much as he feared her vengeance, a part of him longed for it. To be taken by her, to be consumed by her rage, would mean no longer living with the shame. He wondered if that was what she wanted, for him to surrender willingly. He wondered if he was already hers. The night Emmanuel had dreaded finally came. The village was silent, every lamp extinguished early, doors bolted, windows barred. Yet Emmanuel knew locks would not save him. He had felt her drawing closer for days, her whispers louder, her touch colder, her presence heavier. That night, he woke not from a dream, but from the weight of her hand pressing down on his chest. His eyes flew open, and there she was, Sarah, standing over him. Her face pale, her eyes burning with a fire that was neither human nor ghostly. Before he could scream, her grip tightened, and the air fled his lungs. She dragged him from his bed as though he weighed nothing, her strength inhuman. His feet scraped against the floor, his nails clawed at the wood, but she did not stop. The door opened without a sound, and the forest swallowed them both. The trees loomed, black against the moonlight, and Emmanuel's heart pounded louder than the rustle of leaves. She pulled him to the same clearing where she had died, the soil still dark with the memory of her blood. When she released him, he collapsed to his knees, trembling, tears already streaming down his face. He knew there was no escape, no bargaining. He had watched her die once, and now she would watch him die in turn. But instead of binding him, she stood there waiting, her head tilted, her eyes fixed on him. The silence pressed down heavier than chains. Slowly, Emmanuel rose to his feet. His voice broke as he spoke. "I won't fight you, Sarah. I won't run. I should have stood by you that night, and I didn't. I failed you." He lifted his hands to his chest, fingers shaking as he tore at his shirt, ripping it open. "Take me. Strip me. Do what you must. I deserve it." The forest seemed to hold its breath. Sarah stepped forward, her body both beautiful and ruined, her skin shifting between flawless white and torn strips of raw muscle. She reached out and laid her hand flat against his bare chest. The cold sank into his skin, into his ribs, straight to his heart. Emmanuel gasped but did not pull away. Instead, he took her hand and pressed it harder against him, as though guiding her blade. Her other hand lifted slowly, a shard of bone clutched like a knife, jagged and sharp. The point hovered above his chest, so close he could feel it against his skin. His breath came in shallow bursts. She stared at him, her face inches from his, her lips parted as though caught between a scream and a kiss. Emmanuel closed his eyes. "Do it," he whispered. "Make me feel what you felt. If this is the only way to pay for my silence, then take my skin, take all of me. But know that I loved you, even when I was too weak to show it." Her grip trembled. For the first time since she had risen from the grave, she hesitated. The knife hovered, but it did not fall. Her breath hissed, wet and ragged, her body shuddering as though torn between rage and something softer. She leaned close, pressing her forehead against his, her cold skin sticky with rot. Emmanuel held still, his tears mixing with hers, though hers were made of blood. The tension was unbearable. The forest seemed to bend around them, the air thick, the night alive with unseen eyes. Would love restrain her? Would guilt demand his skin? Sarah's jaw clenched, her eyes filling with fire, and she let out a sound that was neither laughter nor sobbing, but both at once. The knife pressed harder against his chest, dimpling the flesh but stopping short of piercing. Emmanuel whispered again, broken but steady, "If you can't forgive me, then end me. If you can, then let me carry you instead." Sarah's hand shook violently. She dragged the blade slowly across his chest, just enough to split the skin, blood welling bright against his pale flesh. Emmanuel did not flinch. He welcomed it, spreading his arms wide as though inviting her to carve deeper. But she stopped. Her eyes searched his face, and for a heartbeat, the rage faded, replaced by something hollow, almost human. Her lips brushed his ear, her whisper damp and chilling. "You belong to me." Then she pulled back, her body trembling with the fury of her choice. The knife remained raised, but her hand would not strike. Emmanuel stood there, bare and bleeding, his heart hammering, knowing that his fate hung on the thin thread of her hesitation. A woman fetching water from the well heard them, screams tearing through the trees, high and ragged, then cut short by silence. The sound froze her where she stood, the bucket slipping from her hands, the water spilling across the dust. Within moments, others heard it too. The villagers gathered in the square, wide-eyed and trembling, clutching one another. No one dared step into the forest, but the screams still echoed faintly in their ears, as though the trees themselves carried them. By midday, a group of men forced themselves to investigate. They moved together, clutching sticks and blades, whispering prayers under their breath. The clearing where Sarah had died lay ahead, the ground black with old stains. When they reached it, they stopped cold. There was no body, no corpse nailed to a tree, no victim crawling in the dirt. There was only blood, thick, fresh, pooling in the grass, soaking the soil until it looked as though the earth itself bled. Drops of it streaked the bark of the tree in long, uneven lines, and the air was heavy with the copper tang that burned the nose and throat. But Emmanuel was gone. His clothes were found torn near the roots, soaked in blood, but his body was nowhere to be seen. Some villagers swore they saw strips of skin hanging high in the branches, flapping like banners in the breeze. But when others looked, nothing was there. The fear grew into something greater than fact. It became belief. By evening, the rumors had spread to every corner of the village. Some said Sarah had spared him, taking him into the forest to keep as her own, neither living nor dead, bound forever to her vengeance. Others whispered that she had skinned him alive and left his hide to rot among the trees. The elders tried to silence the talk, but it was too late. A legend had been born. Children were told never to mock a woman, never to laugh at her pain, for Sarah's ghost would hear. Men were warned never to humiliate a woman, for the naked spirit in the woods would drag them away. And in the nights that followed, when the forest grew too quiet, villagers claimed they still heard her, moans twisting into laughter, footsteps moving just beyond sight. Some swore they saw her silhouette under the moon, a woman's figure, flawless one moment, torn and bleeding the next. Years passed, but the story never faded. Travelers heard of it and carried it onward, changing details but keeping the heart of it the same. Sarah Gibson, stripped naked in shame, returned as vengeance incarnate. She had skinned her tormentors alive, and she would do the same to any man who dared repeat their cruelty. And Emmanuel? His fate was never settled. Some believed he walked the earth still, a hollow man who lived only in nightmares, cursed to carry Sarah's touch forever. Others insisted his skin still hung in the trees, fluttering when no wind blew, a warning to anyone who entered the forest. On certain nights, when the moon was full and pale, the villagers swore the air grew damp and heavy. They said you could hear her laughter mixed with the rustle of leaves, and if you were foolish enough to follow it, you would never return whole. The forest was no longer just trees and soil. It was her shrine, her prison, and her kingdom of vengeance. The story became law. Every man who humiliates a woman will be stripped of his dignity, his flesh, and his life. His screams will echo through the woods, carried forever on the wind, and Sarah, the naked ghost of the forest, will not rest until justice is carved into the skin of the guilty.